He says, if we left this country, it would be a complete of conflicting kingdoms in 3 years flat. So he identifies with the rulers. He also identifies with the outlaw and the rebel. You think of his heroes, Mowgli, the boy who is left in the jungle and adopted by the lord's king, who is this street kid who speaks Hindustani as his mother tongue. The elephant's child, who is spanked by all his relatives and ends up spanking them. I don't think Kipling ever resolved it, and I wouldn't myself try to make a case for Kipling's politics. Particularly after the Boer War, he moves to the right, and Orwell is right, I guess. He is a jingo, and he is a racist. I particularly object to the way Kipling wrote about Jews, kind of personal thing. But there is the but. There is the but, which is Orwell's account of Kipling. Is Kipling a poet? Kipling a public poet? This is a very small part of Kipling, and not, well, it's where he's influenced by his lifetime. But what of his Kipling is, you would never know from Orwell's essay that Kipling was one of the great children's writers of this 20th century or of all time, or that he was one of the great short story writers. André Gide admired him. Alain Fournier admired him and borrowed from him in Le Grand Nerves. Isaac Babel, the Odessan Jew, profoundly admired Kipling's stories and modelled some of his red cavalry ones on him. Hemingway admired and borrowed from him. All that Orwell can find to say about Kipling's stories is a bit about as a tablet of Private Mulvaney and Mrs. Hawksby posing under a palm tree, which I think of myself is a garbled memory of Oscar Wilde's famous jibe about reading plain tales of from the hills, being like sitting under a palm tree reading by superb flashes of vulgarity. What doesn't Orwell mention? Orwell's talent for play and for parody. Kipling's a most wonderful parodist. Charles has quoted him on the Jubilee. I would like to quote something from a similar period. He wrote something called The Mask of Plenty, which sort of consists of which is sort of based around parodies, and it's about what the life of the Indian peasant is really like. And it ends up, it's a sort of send-up of a famous Swinburne poem of the Indian farmer. He eats and hath indigestion, he toils and he may not stop. His life is a long drawn question between a crop and a crop. I think that's terrific. There are just none of that is there. The Just So stories isn't there. The Jungle Books, Kim. Kipling wrote a memoir called Something of Myself, which is actually incredibly reticent and doesn't tell him all the interesting things. But one thing he does say in it is he talks about his inspiration. He says he has a demon, D-A-E-M-O-N, like Socrates' demon. And some of his writing just came to him. The demon gave it to him. And he tells you what that was. He says the Jungle Books and Kim and the Puck stories. And I think if you think of Kipling without those books, Kipling without the demon, it's like, without the books that his demon gave him, it's like Dickens without Pickwick Papers, it's like Hamlet without the Prince. Now the case for Kipling to me is that he's a great, great imaginative writer. And much though I enjoyed Stuart's speech, I don't entirely buy the line that we go to writing to tell us, to give us the reality of ourselves. Not me, I don't. I go into fiction to read a world which I could not otherwise know about, to read about difference. And this I get from Kipling. I cannot think that the Jungle Books are going to go out of are not going to be read because they're quote-unquote irrelevant. The same thing with Kim. The same thing, indeed, with Kipling's short stories. He has a most fantastic range of short stories. I mustn't run over time, but unlike Charles, I greatly admire the middle and later Kipling. And in his later short stories, Orwell says in that essay say Kipling spent the latter part of his life in sulking. Well, politically, this is perfectly true, and you only have to read the letters to confirm it. But the poet wrote these wonderful, wonderful late short stories. Here is a list of their variety, quoting myself from my Kipling book. The last two collections include stuff about ghosts, passionate sexual love. Kipling got very good on that in his late work. Yes, Masonic ritual and its role as therapy for shell shock. The Jane Austen fan club, mourning. He's one of our great writers about bereavement. Cancer, bullfighting, medieval medicine, a literary hoax, motor cars, films, psychosomatic illness, involuntary memory, a missionary journey to St. Paul. And this, I may say, is not an exhaustive list. So, that is my case for Kipling. That, as an imaginative writer, as opposed to a political writer, to my mind, he wins hands down. Thank you.
Well, that's the best ambivalent case for Kipling that you will hear. And then finally, Paul.
Okay, well, like many people here today, I'm sure I first came across Kipling as a child, and I'll never forget the immortal lines. Now I'm the king of the swingers, the jungle VIP. I reached the top and had to stop, and that's what's bothering me. Sorry. Okay. It was the 1967 Disney cartoon movie, The Jungle Book, a global smash hit, which I went to see at the Pearly Odeon with my dad and sisters soon after it came out. And I wish I could report that it was the beginning of a lifelong enthusiasm for Kipling, but it wasn't. I read The Jungle Book soon after. I saw the film but didn't really like it. As Kipling enthusiasts said at the time, the film was not at all true to his stories, and well, at the age of 7, I wanted the lyrics of "Wanna Be Like You" and "Bare Necessities," which weren't there in the book. Kipling, in other words, didn't speak to me on my first encounter, and no one really encouraged me to explore further. I read Kim after The Jungle Book, but didn't quite understand it. I think I was too young. And I came across Gunga Din, Recessional, If, and The White Man's Burden, Kipling's greatest hits in poetry, if you like, in anthologies when I was a teenager. But that was just about it. Kipling wasn't on the secondary school English literature syllabus in the 1970s. Thanks to F.R. Leavis and his followers in Cambridge, the only late 19th and early 20th century poets we were supposed to take seriously were Gerald Manley Hopkins, the First World War poets, and of course the modernists, T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound in particular. And no one I knew recommended or explained why Kipling mattered. For years, I dismissed Kipling largely unread as old-fashioned and reactionary, both in his jingoistic politics and in his style of writing. It's only really in middle age that I've got to know and appreciate Kipling's work. And that's been as a byproduct of my interest in the politics and popular culture of British imperialism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. By contrast, I took to Orwell as soon as I discovered Animal Farm at the age of 12, on the recommendation of my grandfather, who'd been a Tribune reader during the 1940s when Orwell was the paper's literary editor. By the time I was 14, I'd worked my way through all his novels and books of reportage, but I never wanted to be Gordon Comstock. I stopped exploring Orwell for a while when I went to university. He wasn't on the reading list for politics, philosophy and economics at Oxford any more than Kipling had been on the reading list for A-level English literature. But I discovered his essays in journalism in my early 20s and have been a devotee ever since. Now, I'm not claiming that my haphazard reading history teaches a general lesson. Everyone has missed key authors, and Kipling was by no means my only one. To my shame, I'd never read Jonathan Swift or Daniel Defoe or Charles Dickens until I reached my 20s. And, well, okay, everyone also has their misplaced enthusiasm. As a teenager, I devoured Aldous Huxley and George Bernard Shaw, and I can't stand them now. Anyway, but you know those are coming there. My experience is entirely irrelevant. It reflects the times in which I've lived. I was born in 1959, at the height of the Cold War. And Orwell, though he died in 1950, was then and remained throughout my early adult life an author who addressed directly the most important political phenomenon of the time, the impact of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the degeneration of that revolution into a totalitarian police state. Kipling, by contrast, dealt with the world that had passed long ago, the era of aggressive imperialism when Britannia ruled the waves and, okay, it's not a joke, waved the rules. Now today, the context has obviously changed. We're more than 20 years on from the collapse of communism in East Central Europe and the Soviet Union, and the past 10 or 15 years have seen what appear on first sight, or what appears on first sight to have been an extraordinary revitalisation of the imperialist spirit among the governments of the rich industrialised world. I don't need to remind anybody about Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. As I speak, the big powers are talking about what they ought to do about Syria and Iran. The white man's burden, in other words, is back big time, or so it seems. So, isn't all over for Orwell and time for a Kipling revival? I don't think so. I'll accept, absolutely, that Kipling was a great populist and popular poet and writer of short stories. I really do like Kipling the poet and the short story writer, I have to admit, and I think that he deserves a wide audience. I accept too that the Bolshevik Revolution and its aftermath no longer matter in the way that they did for 40 years after Orwell's death. But I think that Orwell remains more relevant to our age. And the reason is that Orwell was and is much more than a novelist of his time and a chronicler of social conditions and political events that are now largely of historical interest. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that his novels should be dismissed as anachronisms, or that his great books of reportage, Down and Out in Paris and London, The Road to William Pier, Homage to Catalonia, quaint records of a lost world. They're not. Animal Farm in 1984 are much more than historically specific satires, and even the novels of the 1930s, which have been much criticised, although I think they're flawed and very dated in many respects, are all rather better than most of Orwell's peers' works. The books of reportage remain to me models of how to do it. They're there for every aspiring journalist and should be read. And if all that Orwell had done was the novels and the books of reportage, I say all, although that would have amounted to a massively impressive body of work in itself, I don't think it had quite the current relevance that he has. For me, it's Orwell the essayist and Orwell the columnist, Orwell the intellectual journalist, in other words, that matters most in the early 21st century. 6 years ago, as Tony said, I put together a collection of his As I Please columns for Tribune in a book to mark the paper's 70th anniversary, something I've been meaning to do for years since I worked as the paper's reviews editor, which was Orwell's old job, the reason I actually took it in the first place. But back in the 1980s, I was familiar with the material and knew it would make a good book, but was slightly worried that there would be too much that was obscure to a contemporary reader. My concerns evaporated as I worked on the editing. Yes, the columns needed footnotes, but for the most part, they were as accessible and as fresh as the day they were written. His range of subject matter as a journalist, and I'm not talking here simply about the Tribune columns, you can also look at the work that he did across the board in dozens and dozens of publications, most notably Horizon, Partisan Review, Polemic, and a host of other little magazines, but also Manchester Evening News and The Observer. The range of subject matter there is extraordinary. His prose style precise and demotic. And some of his essays and columns, politics in the English language, some thoughts on the common toad, why I write, and so I could go on, I'm not going to give you a giant list. All will be read as long as there are readers in the way that Swift and Defoe and Milton will be read. And Kipling, well, He's certainly fascinating, he's certainly important, he certainly deserves